Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the monthly economic briefing presented by the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I'm External Affairs Assistant Director Rob Knapp, and it's great to have you with us this morning. It's also great to have government data back with us this morning, although we're not quite back to where we usually are. You may have noticed in our screen that we put up before we actually come on live here, a lot of question marks, still some big X's. So we're not quite back yet. We will have things to talk about this morning, but we won't have new jobs numbers. Those will come out on December 16th, I believe. We'll hear new inflation numbers on December 18th. So we're getting there, but probably next year before we actually have an open screen that looks like it normally does. But in addition to government data back, we also have research fellow Greg Brown, who is back with us. He's getting used to doing these briefings without government numbers. I think he will have done 2 of our 3 shutdown briefings now, so he's a pro in this respect. And he has a lot to talk about because just as we're dealing with a lack of data still, so are the businesses out there that need to be making decisions. So is the Fed, which will be looking at the idea of perhaps lowering interest rates next week. We'll see. What are they looking at? What are businesses looking at? What is anybody looking at right now until we have a regular schedule of data back? Greg's going to talk about that. Several other things. He's going to be up in just a moment. Before we get to him, we'll go through the rules of the road for those of you who might be new with us this morning. So Greg will give a presentation of about 15 to 20 minutes. After that, he is here to answer your questions. You can submit those at any time during the briefing by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are with the media, please let us know of your organization and your questions so we will know to prioritize those questions. If you're with us by phone this morning, you can still ask a question. You can do that by emailing me at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We plan to be here till 9:30, maybe a touch longer, depending on how many questions we get. We'll try to answer as many as we can before we get out of here. All right, last briefing of 2025. Let's do this thing. With us this morning is research fellow and former director, executive director of the Institute, Greg Brown, back to talk to us this morning. So we will say good morning to him. Good morning, Greg. I saw you at the holiday party last night. It was very festive. I'm sure this will be a very festive briefing as well.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, so, sort of interesting times for economic analysts, coming out of the fog of no government data, starting to get some data back online, but it's taken a while. Got to kind of catch up with reports that were sort of missed in October and November, and so it's pushed the timeline out. And in some cases, we're really not going to get new data. So I'm going to go back to the kind of startup slide that we usually show that has the data for the most recent employment report, and sort of use this to set the stage for how we are thinking about things right now. And starting with October, obviously we missed the October report. We're going to get data later this month that will tell us something about what happened to the payrolls survey. So that's the establishment one, and you can kind of go back and fill in the missing October because the businesses that report will tell you a few months worth of data, so we can go back and fill in October. But you can't do that for the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate, because that's the household survey, and that comes from actually talking to people at a particular time in the month and asking them whether they have a job or they're looking for a job. And because the government was not able to collect that data, we just won't ever have an official unemployment rate. We can kind of interpolate and get maybe a sense of what was going on then, but we won't actually have the hard data. So, even as the government plays catch up, there's still, these going to be permanent gaps in some of the data. And then we think about November. I mean, usually, I mean, we do this on the first Friday of the month because that's when the employment report comes out. And so we don't have November now. We're going to have to wait, another week and a half or so to get the November data. And on top of that, we don't even have much in terms of expectations. So if you go to our regular source, which is the kind of Bloomberg survey of economists in terms of what they expect, there's just a few folks reporting right now, and that's sort of I would say not very informative in terms of what expectations are for what happened in November. So there's still this kind of, I would say, uncertainty around what's happening with recent economic activity. Of course, there's non-governmental reports that have come out, and we can talk a little bit about some of those. And I think I'm going to be the dreaded, two-handed economist today, and sort of, do a little bit of what I did last time, which is provide the bull case and the bear case. And I think it's interesting right now to do that because we are at this point where I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction of the economy. And depending on which indicators you look at, you can make a reasonably good bull case and a reasonably good bear case in terms of what kind of future economic activity is going to be. And of course, the Fed is going to meet next week, and we're going to have an announcement about who the next Fed chair is going to be, or at least the nominee for the Fed chair. That could have implications for what rates are going to be in the future. So just a lot of uncertainty both in terms of the economy and how businesses and households should be thinking about what's going to happen in the future, as well as policymakers. So with that, let's just kind of move into some of the data. Again, this is like pretty dated data now, but it helps us kind of set the stage for what we do know that's more current. Unemployment rate is coming off a very low number from 2021, and has sort of been gently trending up over the last couple of years or so. And we're sort of at a number that is probably in the 4.5% range still, because we haven't really seen anything dramatic happen in the labor data that we can observe. And so what does that mean? Well, that's kind of consistent with sort of a stable, neutral, what people call the natural unemployment rate. And so, I don't think there's a lot of information there because it hasn't been, it isn't in sort of a danger zone, or it hasn't had like radical moves up, and sort of consistent with sort of the soft landing that, the Fed was hoping to engineer. That said, when we look at the actual non-farm payroll numbers. And so, we did get a report for what happened through September, and that included revised numbers for earlier in the year. So we do see, what sort of is like clearly softness happening sort of since the spring, where we've had a couple negative prints on the revised data. The most recent number was positive, but you look at sort of the 3-month moving average, and it's getting darn close to zero. And we saw that the expectation for November was probably a number that's pretty close to zero, like 30, 40,000 or so. So that's below the historical labor force growth rate. And so you would expect the unemployment rate to continue to trend up. But there may be a caveat to that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. And of course, the Fed, is sort of tasked with this dual mandate of full employment and low and stable, low inflation, stable prices. There was some concern about what was happening with the Fed's preferred inflation measure. That's the core PCE deflator. And, it looked like maybe it was starting to tick up again after kind of coming down and coming down off the highs that we saw in 2022, during 23 and 24, but the things were maybe starting to level off and tick back up earlier this year. But it does seem like things have leveled off, around 3%. But like 3% is still too high, right? That's sort of above the 2% target of the Fed. I think people thought, well, there were sort of some special situations there, like maybe fears about tariffs, and the tariffs haven't been as high as what people were expecting. Back when there was, I would say, sort of more of an inflation scare around tariffs in the spring. But still 3%, leveling off at 3% seems too high. from a stated policy perspective, and the core PCE tends to run a little bit cooler than the CPI. And so, we're, back prior to COVID, we were at this kind of range that seemed like it was pretty good, like just below 2%. And of course, we had this big inflation shock, and then now we're running what seems to be pretty consistently around 3%. So, from a Fed policy perspective, we were kind of into this easing cycle now. The expectation is, pretty strong, like 90-ish% that we'll see another easing next week from the FOMC. But then I think there's, some, the White House in particular, I think wants to see a more aggressive easing and, to help stimulate the economy. But again, it's hard to see how you could go on too aggressive of an easing with inflation that's still running above target. So, all this, sort of begs the question of, well, what is the right rate? Is it 3.5% or 2% or 1%? It isn't that lower is always better. A easy way to think about that is, sort of what's the real Fed funds rate, so inflation adjusted Fed funds rate, and how does that, kind of compare to where we are in terms of real economic activity. And so, the real Fed funds rate, that's the blue line here, and so over here on the right scale, it's like 1.75% right now. So that's maybe slightly above the kind of neutral, what people call our star rate. But it's not way above it. It's not super high. It's not as high as it was, a year or so ago. And it's not as high as it was, prior to the COVID shock. Eh, uh, Prior to the GFC or even the Gulf recession. So, it's sort of roughly in line with the long run average. Of course, we had very low interest rates for a long time after GFC, and then we had sort of negative rates, largely because of the bump in inflation that pushed down the real rate to being negative. But as things have normalized, we've normalized to something that feels not too far from neutral. So an aggressive Fed easing would be something that would be consistent with a quite a weak economy, and maybe you can make that case on the employment front. I think people, are saying there is some risk there. I'm going to jump ahead to a slide that shows that. So this is the ADP data that came out this week. So ADP is, sort of the best employment, broadest employment number that we have, absent the government statistics, and it showed a decline, and in particular showed a decline among small businesses. So large and medium-sized businesses continued to add jobs modestly, but that was more than offset by job losses among small businesses. So there is this concern that the unemployment rate is potentially going to go up. That's a sign of a soft economy. The Fed needs to be easing, but there's other things that suggest the opposite. If we look at the term spread, so the term spread has historically been one of the best predictors of a recession. And when the term spread is negative, that predicts recession historically. So you can see, these periods here where the term spread has been negative, there's been always been followed by a recession. That did not happen with this fairly large and long inverted yield curve that finally kind of normalized to upward sloping this year. So the term spread isn't suggesting that the economy is headed for a recession. Um, if we look at what the market is expecting for monetary policy, on the other hand, it's expecting that rates will continue to come down from the Fed. So these are the futures. The market, I just printed this off this morning from Bloomberg. And the way you read this is that the expected interest rate is 100 minus this number here. So as this goes up, it's actually means that over the next year or so that the market is expecting interest rates to come down. It's not expecting them to come down as much as it did 3 months ago, but it is still expecting rates to come down another 0.5% over the next year or so. So, there's kind of lots of different things in the mix. Hard to figure out what's going on with the lack of government data. And so, we've continued to be forced to look at the kind of private sector data. And again, it's a mixed bag. So if we look at, say, consumer confidence, there's two common cited measures of consumer confidence. One that's done by the Conference Board, which is sort of more how people feel about the economy broadly. And then the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Number, which is sort of more how people feel about their personal, finances and essentially things like inflation and whether it's, a good time to buy a car or a house and affordability there. And the people are feeling like generally okay about the economy as a whole. That's the blue line. It's kind of consistent with long run averages, but quite bad about their own situation. So that's not great. Um, if we look at the initial claims for unemployment, this is data we've continued to get because it's collected at the state level. In contrast here, we see that there really hasn't been any kind of meaningful bump in new claims for unemployment insurance. This is data that we get pretty frequently. We get it weekly, and has historically been a pretty good indicator of what was to come with employment. Nothing really to speak of there. If anything, it's kind of the numbers are down a little bit in the most recent readings. So that's sort of a sign of a stable labor market. I already showed you this. This is the ADP number, which is showing a net loss of jobs, but again, difference between large and small companies. And then kind of one other indicator that's, I think, a good private sector indicator. And this is the Institute for Supply Management survey of purchasing managers. And it has also historically has done quite a good job of tracking what's happening in the economy on a real-time basis. And they do two surveys. One is of manufacturers, and the other is of service providers. And they sort of just ask them questions around what's happening to new orders and employment at their shop, prices paid, things like that. And they create a composite index out of this. And I would say it's been pretty stable. Both of these have been pretty stable. Um, I guess the mixed news here, even within these surveys, is that things on the manufacturing side, this blue line, have been pretty stable, but below 50. 50 is the kind of the benchmark for this. Below 50 means sort of weak or contracting slightly. So not a horrific number, but still below 50 for manufacturing. Whereas the service industry is kind of bumping along 50 there for a while, but has picked back up. Last couple months have been above 50. Um, and so, even these surveys are sort of telling us different things about what may be happening in manufacturing versus the broader economy. Um, the caveat, even within these, is that one of the questions they ask of the purchasing managers is, are the prices you're paying for your inputs right now higher or lower than they were last month? And there's a fairly strong bias towards people reporting that prices are higher. So that's essentially wholesale inflation. And this survey picks that up as a good thing because it's a sign of like a strong economy, that there's sort of pricing power in the wholesale market. But of course, it could be a bad thing in the current circumstance, where, as I already mentioned, we think inflation might be running a little bit hot and stabilized at a level that's kind of hot. And so these higher prices paid are really a sign of inflation, perhaps coming from tariffs or labor shortages in certain sectors. So if you sort of discount that component of these surveys, then you sort of shift these both down a little bit to maybe places that aren't so favorable. So again, I'm being the classic two-armed economist here and sort of saying it's unclear what's going on, could be good, could be bad. But there's actually a theory that I think is gaining some traction that sort of pulls a common thread through the data that we're seeing. And that is that the economy is actually pretty strong. And yeah, there's a variety of indicators, some that I've showed you, but other things like stock market prices have been high. We're, sort of at or near record highs in most of the major US stock indices. Credit markets seem to be quite happy with the amount of credit risk that is in the economy right now. So credit spreads are tight. That's a sign of bond investors being confident they're going to get paid back, and that's consistent with a good economy. And so it could be that there's something kind of weird happening in the labor market. And the theory here is that the weakness we're seeing in the labor market is not a lack of demand for labor, it's a lack of supply of labor. And that lack of supply is coming especially from a reduction in the workforce related to immigrant workers. And some of that might be undocumented people, but it also could be documented workers that have decided either it's harder to get employed here, or potentially documented workers say with the H-1B, businesses are reluctant to hire on H-1Bs because of the increased cost, or maybe it's a family situation where there's one person who's a documented worker and another person who isn't in a household, and they decide that they're not going to be labor force participants in the U.S. anymore. So there's sort of anecdotal story that's consistent with tighter immigration policy that would suggest that the supply of labor has gone down, and that would explain some of the weakness that we're seeing in the labor market statistics over the last 6 months or so. And then there's some other special circumstances, such as we know there's been a fairly significant decline in government employment related to decreases in federal employment from sort of Doge type activities. So you put all this together, and you can sort of potentially explain why the labor market looks weak while other indicators look strong. And some people are saying, looking forward, there's even a risk that we're going to have a lot of fiscal stimulus from the recent big beautiful bill that's likely to hit the economy next year. So something in the range of hundreds of billions of dollars of fiscal stimulus. Some people have estimated that will generate up to an additional 1% of GDP next year. And if you end up with a Fed that becomes very accommodative, then you could have monetary stimulus on top of that, and that could be something that is dangerous in terms of inflation risks going forward. So again, it's really hard to understand what's happening right now. We're in this weird kind of middle ground, and different indicators pointing in different directions. But there's at least one theory out there that points towards the economy being quite strong. Perhaps too strong going forward if we really do have additional stimulus that hits the economy next year. So with that, I'm happy to take questions from folks. And Rob, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg Brown. If you have not used the dreaded two-handed economist as a Halloween costume yet, I would suggest that you put that on your list for next year. Okay, we are taking questions, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask us anything you would like to. Greg will take a shot at those. And if you're a member of the media, please remember to include your organization so we can prioritize those questions. If you're on the phone with us this morning and want to ask a question, you can email it to me at rob_knapp@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. To the questions from Dan Barkin at Business NC. With all the capital investment in AI, what metrics do economists look at to see AI autonomy is working its way into the economy?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's two ways that people have been looking at this. One is sort of a bottoms up approach where they're sort of saying, okay, we can actually go look at the hyperscalers and other people that are making large capex investments and sort of tally up with what they've claimed they're going to be spending over the next few years or so, and those are quite large numbers. And they're forward looking, so they're sort of interesting to think about what you're going to see going forward. The other is more of a tops down approach, and so we see as part of the well, I would say typically we see as part of government statistics, measures of essentially capex spending. So you see, these kind of factory orders numbers. You see, non-residential construction numbers where you'd see data centers and things starting to show up. All of the related infrastructure around, energy production and other things. So, we have seen a big boom in sort of that actual, what people call non-farm business spending. It shows up in GDP as part of the I component, investment component. And so we have seen a decent amount of sort of capex spending working its way through the economy, but there there's spillover effects to that as well, right? So it isn't just that the data center is being built; it's that you've got construction employment for all the people that are actually building the data center, and the power plants and the roads and all all of the things related to it. So, I mean, I think the feeling is that this has been a significant contributor to growth currently and will continue to be something around the order of 1% of GDP, which from a growth rate is a significant amount. So, it's I think the concern is what happens if that's a bubble and it goes away. That's been a big part of the talk as well, that a sudden cessation in that could be a trigger for a recession.
Okay. Let's see. To the jobs issue, Barbara Senich writes, we continue to hear that entry-level jobs are hard to come by due to AI and other issues. With regard to unemployment data interpretation, I believe that new grads and people with spotty work histories are not eligible to apply. While this may be too small to matter, is there any chance that we are undercounting unemployment to a greater degree than previously?
I think there is always that risk, and there's a variety of challenges in terms of measuring what actual unemployment is. Just from the household survey, there's sort of different ways of thinking about who's employed, unemployed, underemployed, not in the workforce, and those can be sort of gray areas, and people have different opinions on it. Um, you know, it- you have to have looked for work in over the last month to be considered unemployed. If you don't have a job, you have to have looked for work. And so I think going to this, that entry level people or young people, I mean, they may be less likely to be even trying to enter the labor force, and in that sense, we could be undercounting unemployment. And we do know that um, the kind of labor force growth rates have sort of stalled out in the data. I mean, again, we don't have the most recent data, but those numbers have sort of leveled off as well. And we also know that unemployment rates among young people and lower skilled workers tend to be higher and more economically sensitive. So, I mean, I think there is that risk for sure. And the hard part is how do you get a better handle on it, because we have the data that we have. And so, you would have to sort of start to rely on more alternative data sources to really dig into that. Um, and then I think when we think about, a decent chunk of employment in the US is undocumented workers. And so they're also going to be tracked in a different way, right? So the household survey doesn't ask people their immigration status. But to the extent that you're not going to get through to somebody now who isn't in the country anymore or working, or doesn't maybe for other reasons doesn't want to participate in the survey, then that could be another reason you're undercounting unemployment or underemployed people.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Another labor supply question. Is there a reason you would think that both the supply and demand for labor would come down at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, this could get to. I mean, they wouldn't have to be related, and they could certainly happen at the same time. I think this gets to some of the thoughts around, what is the real impact of AI? And I mean, frankly, the way I see it is it is very hard to differentiate between sort of the hype around AI, what businesses say that they want to do or are doing versus what's actually happening. So, I talk to a lot of people in the financial services industry, and there's all this talk of like, inverting the pyramid and really scaling back on entry level, people and all of this because AI can do all this kind of stuff. But it's really hard for me to tell whether that's what they want to do or that's what's really happening. So, that could be a reason that demand goes down. uh, it's not clear what that does to the supply of labor. So, but maybe there's other reasons such as immigration or cyclical factors related to people's willingness to be in the U.S. labor force, right? So, um, I think you can have both. It's not super obvious to me how a single economic force would drive both, minus something like we had in COVID, where obviously there's a pandemic shock that's gonna decrease both supply and demand.
Okay. Let's see. We may call this one the last one for the day. So next week there's a big upset, a big surprise, and the announcement from the Fed is new Fed Chairman Greg Brown.
Huh.
So,
No, thank
first
you.
of all, congratulations. So what would be your take on continuing to use that 2% number as a target for inflation? And what other things would you have on your mind to look at the Fed with your newfound powers?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's been on and off talk about, is 2% the right number? Maybe 3% is a better number. It gives you more flexibility to have negative rates. And, like it doesn't, in some broad economic sense, it doesn't really matter too much as long as it's stable, what the target is. So, I don't have a strong feeling on that. It would be potentially a weird time to make that change because, in some ways it could be like Monday morning quarterbacking in the sense that, oh, we got 3% inflation, so that's the new target. Maybe not the signal the Fed wants to send. There has certainly been talk around, the politicalization of the Fed and the next chair, and in particular, Kevin Hassett, who appears to be the front runner, being someone that would, be more political. I actually worked for Kevin Hassett when he was at the Fed, and I don't keep up with him a lot right now. But I mean, he's a legit economist, right? I mean, he's a real guy. He's not somebody just kind of pulled out at random. He understands economics, understands macro. Actually he worked in the business investment group. I was his RA like 30 years ago at the Fed. And I mean, he's a serious guy. Now, he is also a political guy, and so maybe, compared to some of the other candidates, he would be more likely to ease. But I mean, he understands what the role of the Fed is, and I think some of the comments he's made more publicly suggest that he's, trying to provide some reassurance to the research staff there that he isn't going to come in and like doge the place or something. And so I'd like to think that there will still be an effective Fed, regardless of who the new chair is. I think markets are okay with the slate of candidates, and I think if there was a lot of worry about some like crazy monetary policy, what you would see is that the break-even inflation rates from the Treasury inflation protected securities, so that's essentially the market's forecast for inflation, that they would go up a bunch, and they haven't. They've been pretty stable. Maybe a little bit. They're still a little bit above 2%, maybe a little higher than what you'd like to see and what we saw prior to COVID, but they haven't gone bonkers. There still seems to be a lot of confidence that U.S. monetary policy will stay on the rails and sort of do something close to the right thing, over whatever the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, some great insight there. Thank you very much. I have already received one endorsement, basically a vote for Fed chair for you. So I don't know if it'll count or anything, but you do have some support out there. We'll see if we can get this bandwagon rolling in the next week or
No,
so.
thank you. You can't get rid of me.
Nor would we want to. Thank you very much, Greg Brown, for all your insight, as always. Appreciate it very much, just as we appreciate the questions from the folks out there. It keeps us rolling, so we appreciate it very much. For those of you in the media, if you'd like to continue the conversation, talk to Greg or any of our other experts about any of the projects you're working on, please reach out to me, Rob_Knapp at Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu, and we will set something up. For everybody in the audience, we hope you'll check out our website at kenaninstitute.unc.edu. We have a couple of new things coming up. Next week, we will debut our Grand Challenge yearbook for this year, a look back at our look at the skills gap in 2025 in a pretty cool format that will allow you to find the things that you might have missed during the year, revisit some of the things that you didn't miss. Check it out. It'll be great. And speaking of Grand Challenge, in the coming month, we will announce our new Grand Challenge for 2026, the topic that we are going to spend a lot of time looking at and digging into. So I hope that you will keep an eye out for that. Couple of scheduling notes. The next time they actually release jobs numbers, we will not be on the air with that. That, I believe, comes December 16th. There are inflation numbers coming December 18th, so things to look forward to, but not necessarily for us to talk about in real time. We will be back on January 9th with a new slate of numbers from December employment. So that's the next time you should look for us, and we will have a registration link out for that today with the email that comes to everybody who attended the briefing. We hope you'll sign up, and we hope to see you in January. Thanks for a great 2025. We appreciate it very much. Have a good Friday.